Thank you very much to all of you for being here tonight. I think it's great to see so many people in week 7, Monday week 7. I think this clearly shows that the interest in Tolkien is strong and growing in this university, his university. My name is Beppe Pezzini. I am a fellow at Corpus Christi College, and I'm one of the members of the Tolkien network, which is a network of academics and students who carry out academic research on Tolkien in the University of Oxford. And the lecture that we have tonight is in a way the climax of a series of events that we have organized in the last year and a half to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death. So I want to start thanking all the people who have contributed to this project, and especially to Grace Curry and Simon Horobin, who have organized this series of seminars this term, but also all the others, Mark, Anine, and especially Julia Walworth, who is the librarian here at Merton, who is our gracious host tonight and has given us the possibility to be here in this beautiful lecture theatre. But above all, we need to give special thanks to our distinguished speaker, Michael Tolkien. He has been very generous to be here tonight. I'm very excited, we are all very excited to hear from him tonight. And I want to stress, not just because of his relationship with his grandfather, that's not the whole point. I think also Michael will add other important perspectives to the variety of approaches to Tolkien scholarship that we have seen in the course of the year. To recollect the journey, the path that we have been walking together, this year we have heard Tolkien papers from an impressive range of different academic fields, and I quote, I can mention cultural history, medievalism, romanticism, linguistics, classics, philosophy, theology, environmental studies, peace building, and even paleoanthropology. And this variety of perspectives, I think, is one of the greatest assets of Tolkien scholarship, which I think we need to cherish, protect, and also encourage to interact with each other, which is what we have been trying to do in the course of the last year and a half. The perspectives that Michael will offer to us tonight include, of course, the biographical perspective, and a special one, but also the perspective of the literary critic and the poet, the writer. Apart from being a former teacher, Michael is a prolific literary critic and author of many articles and essays on contemporary poetry, and also he himself is a poet, an accomplished writer, and the author of many collections, and I show you the last one, which was published a few months ago, which is called Alive in Winter. And if you go online on the website, it's quite easy to remember, www.michaeltolkien.com, you can find out more about Tolkien's work. I think Michael has a unique combination of different perspectives, the biographical, the critical, but also the creative, or maybe sub-creative one. And I think this combination is invaluable, and we are very grateful that he has decided to share with us tonight. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say, which I'm sure will speak uniquely to everyone, to quote a line from his poetry, which I like very much. I think I've spoken enough. Apologies. I think I can leave the floor to Michael now, but before I'll ask you to join me in applause of gratitude for him. Thank you very
much. My name is Tolkien, not Kine. It is a German name from Saxony, an anglicization of Tolkien, that is Tolkien. But except as a guide to spelling, this fact is as fallacious as all facts in the law. For I am neither foolhardy, as the name implies, nor German, whatever some remote ancestors may have been. These are not my words, but only about me as an accidental inheritor of that name. I'm quoting from my grandfather's notes to his American publishers after a New York Times book reviewer made some fatuous assumptions. It is the combative and punctilious flavor of much that he said and did, anticipating what I would like to celebrate. I was always made to feel, from my parents' exaggerated accounts, that I came into the world on indirectly bad terms with my grandfather, though I did become a source of reconciliation. He and my grandmother had disapproved of my father Michael's hasty wartime marriage to my mother, who was one of many nurses that he fell in love with when he was being treated for the shell shock he only superficially got over. Judging by the various rows, which usually took the form of irate and pompous letters on either side, my grandparents found reasons to justify their reservations. Ostensibly, my father's lack of means and prospects. More disturbingly, my mother's apparently uncultured, lower middle class, Church of England background. My paternal grandparents were staunch Roman Catholics. My grandfather had a deep and nourishing faith, but my grandmother simply retained the prejudices and never attended church after being offended by one priest's attitudes. All this had really been brewing for years. My father's unpublishable autobiographical attempt to make sense of and to some extent idealize the conflicts and confusions of his childhood reveals that he felt an obsessive need to establish belief in himself and to secure his parents' attentions. I recall him saying bitterly that he was once told in one of his rebellious moments that his not being a girl was a disappointment to his parents. He also told me proudly that he walked out after one of those disputes that isn't really about the issue at stake, and on the eve of the 39-45 war, he signed on with a local regiment for 21 years. But he also went ahead and married my mother in the autumn of 1941 in a hush-hush Roman Catholic ceremony. One result, after a terrible labour, was me, J.R.R.'s first grandson, born in January 1943 to the sound of the Luftwaffe pounding Birmingham. I'm now the same age as he was when he passed away in September 1973. I'm often asked if it's a nuisance to have a name so unusual that I can't escape from the inevitable curious comments. In fact, the name is often productive of amusement. I have collected at least 30 variations in spelling and pronunciation, from Torqueen to Chocken, which would have fascinated my grandfather. But I hope that what I'm going to say will be a kind of answer to this suggestion of being burdened. The anecdotes I started with were merely to provide a context for my first connections with Tolkien. Simply to relate experiences has the danger of becoming sentimental, self-indulgent, or directionless. Not dissimilar to detailed accounts of dreams, really only of interest to the person who dreamt them. Any recalling of past events is, of course, coloured by our motives for doing so, and, of course, by subtler influences wrongly assumed to be memories, such as what close relatives have said. Photographs, which tend to distort accurate recollection. My own literary interest in my grandfather's work will be leading me from talking about Tolkien as I knew him to Tolkien as I would in part like him to be understood as a thinker and a writer. When the American edition of Carpenter's biography came out, one critic said that it had neglected to tell us all we would like to know about Tolkien the man in his mature years. I can only begin to take up this challenge, and wherever possible I've tried to objectify memories and impressions by referring to letters and to my experience of him as it emerges from me for the actual works. I'm also going to be quite specific about my grandfather's impact upon me at certain formative periods in my life. For example, I was obliged to study Anglo-Saxon and medieval texts as part of my English literature course at St Andrews University in the mid-1960s. He was an acknowledged authority on and currently translating some of these works, and we corresponded copiously then. Quoting from some of the personal letters will serve my dual purpose of establishing a picture of the author and revealing his part as a grandparent. I lent all my letters to Humphrey Carpenter when he was cooperating with my uncle Christopher Tolkien to publish a selection in 1978. He said, "These are full of good things of every kind and reflect the very great range of his mind." A comment which may be applied to the entire invaluable collection of letters, now just republished by HarperCollins, with many interesting additions. By coincidence, my grandfather had delivered the Andrew Lang Memorial Lecture at St Andrews University in 1939. This is unfortunately described in the still official biography as one of the, quote, endless distractions that prevented him from working on The Lord of the Rings. In fact, it contained the bases for the astute and witty and delightfully prejudiced and uncompromising essay on fairy stories known to us as Tree and Leaf, which clarifies what he was doing in The Lord of the Rings and is one of the best implicit guides to the art and concepts of Tolkien's fantasies. I will quote from this later in my talk to confirm some of my implications about his inventiveness as an author. My literary training makes me acutely aware of certain critical trends, which I will touch on both because they've affected the way that Tolkien's life and works have been viewed in some quarters, and because I hope my approach may suggest how to steer a middle course between various extremes. First, the biographical fallacy. Know your author intimately and you have an open sesame to his works. Especially tempting with Tolkien, since many of his fictional writings provoke their devotees into personal and programmatic theories, which might even be substantiated by how he held his knife and fork, or as the poet Philip Larkin says of his fictional lodger, Mr. Bleeny, his preference for sauce to gravy. Tolkien himself anticipated this as early as 1935 in a letter to W.H. Auden, where he talks about the great spider Shelob, successor to Ungoliant, co-agent of the destruction of Valinor in the Silmarillion. If that had anything to do with my being stung by a tarantula when I was a small child, people are welcome to the notion. I can only say that I remember nothing about it. I do not dislike spiders, and I have no urge to kill them. I usually rescue those that I find in the bath. But it is nevertheless true that my father Michael had a phobia about spiders, and their humiliation by Bilbo in Mirkwood was partly written with him in mind, to undermine their more menacing side. Perhaps all great writing transcends the writer himself. He writes as he does because of, but also in spite of who he is. This notion often troubled the poet W.B. Yeats, who maintained he'd write at his best for his opposite, or someone without his prejudices, preoccupations, and neuroses, like his imagined Connemara fisherman, a man who does not exist, a man who is but a dream. Before I am old, I shall have written him one poem, maybe as cold and passionate as the dawn. I think I'm also echoing my grandfather's feelings if I touch on the critical tendency at looking for watertight theories about the works, reading in references to world or contemporary history, on the assumption that Middle-earth is, in inverted commas, real, a relatively useless term at the best of times, Critics are seldom content to say, this is what X suggests to me. Responses turn into hard and fast interpretations. Even worse, vast significance is attached to what is not in the books. I'm sure many of you have read a marvelously sustained university fantasy, David Lodge's Changing Places, and may recall from it Professor Maurice Zapp's plan to anticipate comprehensively every conceivable future dissertation on and theory about Jane Austen's life and works. A fine piece of double-edged irony on Lodge's part, because it expresses both an absurd critical ambition and a malaise within the whole industry. Let me quote. The idea was to be utterly exhaustive, to examine the novels from every conceivable angle: historical, biographical, Freudian, Jungian, existentialist, Marxist, structuralist, Christian allegorical, ethical, exponential, linguistic, phenomenological, archetypal, you name it. So that when each commentary was written, there would simply be nothing further to say about any of the novels in question. After Zapp, to misquote Hamlet, the rest would be silence. Tolkien himself disclaims inner meanings and messages in his own very substantial foreword to The Lord of the Rings. But in Tree and Leaf, he talks about the creator of fantasy achieving an inner consistency of reality, a world inherently believable in its own terms. So perhaps he became the victim of his own success in doing this. He certainly always maintained that he was exploring rather than inventing the legends accredited to him. His imaginative world became so vast that much of it was imponderable to its conceiver, as the unfinished and perpetually developing Silmarillion suggests. The way to keep a clear perspective on the apparent clash between two kinds of reality, imaginative and literal, is to look at the literary means by which he brought his imaginative world into being and the preoccupations of the mind that created it. My Uncle Christopher's scholarly tracing of the entire literary and imaginative history of the Ring in 12 volumes is an indispensable part of achieving an assessment on appropriate lines. And I hope this talk will help to demonstrate how both biographical material and well-directed critical judgments may cooperate to achieve a proper estimate of Tolkien's stature as a man and an author. My memories of him as a philologist are of prime importance in this respect, and I want to dispense at once with any aridly academic associations of that term. In his Deutsches Wörterbuch, Grimm divided philologists into two types. First, those who study words for the sake of things. Secondly, those who study words only for the sake of words. The latter may become pedants or often quite remarkable lexicographers. I'd place my grandfather in the former group. If a poet, or indeed a narrator or descriptive writer, is distinguished from others at all, it's surely by a love of words and their potential force and associations. In Beowulf, the special value of well-chosen words is drawn attention to when that hero addresses Hrothgar's delegation. Him se illister answarda, Werodis Wisa, word hoard unlag. The chieftain, the leader of the troop, gave him his answer, unlocked his word hoard. Words were a commodity to be used with care and reverence. In The Merchant's Tale, Chaucer cites a late Latin poem and speaks of the marriage of Mercury, the creative, quick-thinking spirit, with philology, the love of words. And there's a story that Mallarmé, a distinguished early 20th century French poet, was approached by a young poet, distressed that he had no ideas with which to finish a sonnet, only to be told curtly, poetry is not made with ideas, but with words. I've cited these details partly to dispel any notions of Tolkien as a kind of talking dictionary with dry expertise about derivations. It is also revealing that when he was studying for a crucial part of his degree in 1912, he discovered in Exeter College Library a Finnish grammar. And years later, he told W.H. Auden, it was like discovering a complete wine cellar filled with bottles of a kind and flavour never tasted before. It quite intoxicated me. In fact, he nearly lost his exhibition award and got sent down, or so he said. And, he said, I gave up the attempt to invent an unrecorded Germanic language and my own my own language or series of invented languages became heavily Finnicized in phonetic pattern and structure. But we should not isolate this discovery from his fascination with the ancient Finnish epic, the Kalevala, beloved of Sibelius. Later, he became an authoritative linguistic scholar, but he always gave me the impression that words, in an almost physical sense, have a special kind of life to be pondered, savoured, and probed. I recall family occasions, usually meals with cross-currents of chat. He had the ability to carry on several conversations at once, debating the merits of a recipe, exploding wrong theories about a place name, telling anecdotes about an eccentric character, and under his breath trying to solve a linguistic matter that had arisen unnoticed by anybody else. In my imagination, he became the ultimate authority on the origins of names and the uses and abuses of words. He would expose common assumptions so rapidly and overwhelmingly, you were compelled to listen and agree. But he also respected words that were perplexing, and he delighted in their elusiveness. When he became involved in linguistic matters to do with his own works, he proved particularly sharp in disabusing theoreticians and critics of their misconceptions. His disciplined academic training, of course, gave him a great advantage, as well as adding to his frustrated impatience in making people face up to the loose way they used words and phrases. Two letters illustrate this amusingly. There's far too much to quote, but I warmly recommend his analysis of a Daily Telegraph magazine interview in 1967 by Charlotte and Dennis Plimmer, and his two letters to Allen and Unwin early in 1961 about the introduction to the Swedish translation of The Lord of the Rings. And incidentally, but significantly, his profound disappointment and concern over the omission of the appendices. When I was an advanced student of medieval and Anglo-Saxon literature, I appreciated all this much more. As a child or as a teenager, he did not influence me to have particular curiosity over words. I think I mostly enjoyed his genial war on little minds. Later, though, I really began to respect and wish to consult his knowledge and to experience his powers of exposition. His letters of 1965 show he was pleased when my linguistic studies became of positive interest. Excerpts throw light on some of his attitudes and on him as a grandparent. Referring to the medieval poems I was studying and he was translating at that time, he says, I'm sorry that my Gawain and Pearl will not be in time to assist you, largely owing to my discovering many minor points about words which led me off. But truthfully it is, I suppose, just a private amusement. He then suggests I might like to read The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, Beorhthelm's son, along with his accompanying essay. And he goes on to say, I'm glad you like the earlier literature, and I hope you will be rewarded for your work by worthy examiners. I have you much in heart and thought. In a later letter, he wrote, I'm of course deeply interested in all that you have to tell me about your work and your tastes. I might have given you more help and advice in parts of your work where I have special knowledge, but I've been under much pressure while you've been at St. Andrews. This refers especially to the battle over the pirate edition of The Lord of the Rings in the USA by Ace Books. If you lived nearby, in an hour I could do what would take days to do less satisfactorily in writing. But in any case, I have a strong feeling that you should not be influenced in growth of taste and discovery of aptitudes by opinions possibly weighted by family loyalty and affection, while in the end you will get more credit for your own industry and talents if you do not show much evidence of being under my shadow. In October 1965, I sent him a copy of a test that we had had in Middle English, and he wrote that I seemed flea-bitten by pernickety dogs. And he said, I looked at the enclosed paper, but all this business of examining afflicts me now like a sickness. I had 40 years of it. I'm sticking to my decision not to confuse the issue by sending you any of my notes on Beowulf, Gawain, and Pearl before your finals. And then, with characteristic shift of ground, he says, I should be interested to hear your opinion on question 3, part 3, since the 2 lines from Pearl, stanza 5, cannot be discussed without discussing the whole stanza. Well, I felt these letters showed how well he wrote to a grandson with a mixture of frankness and ease and an instinct for apt tone. But when I later opted to specialise in 17th and 18th century English literature in my B.Phil studies at Oxford, he showed equal interest and was full of amusing anecdotes about the authors I chose to read and enthuse over, roaring with laughter at his own jokes, as was so characteristic. Before discussing more closely the links between the philology and the fictional works, I'd like to mention a few pertinent anecdotes. I remember sitting with him in hot August sun, a month before he died, and watching butterflies on a buddleia bush. He told me in great detail how the word butterfly was etymologically a dead end. No one had ever discovered how or why the 2 words had been associated. The displacing of sounds in flutterby wouldn't do either. As usual, I found that any word he discussed took on a new dimension, and so did the object that it was attached to. When my first daughter, Catherine, was born in 1969, he was very concerned to explain in a long letter all the vagaries of spelling attached to this name. I meant to have a say over the matter of my great-granddaughter's name, and now it's settled. But I meant to support you in Catharin. A lengthy philological discussion followed, typically sandwiched between all kinds of mundane matters. But his enthusiastic command of detail compelled one to read on and to learn. Incidentally, one of my most clear memories, happily assisted by a photograph, is of his entertaining my then 3.5-year daughter, Catherine, with spontaneous quotations from Tom Bombadil poems as we sat in the garden of my aunt's house in Summertown, Oxford, in July 1972. It typified his lifelong gift for striking an answering note in children without in any way seeming other than his unique, versatile self. He always thought highly of Jonathan Swift, less for the ingenious and biting satire, some of which he probably felt relied too heavily on allegory, than for inventing a new sound in the language by using the word Yahoo to describe the humanoid apes of Gulliver's Travels before. In April 1957, when I was 14 and first reading The Lord of the Rings with absorption, he wrote me a letter which illuminates his wide-ranging linguistic interests and how he could talk about them to a teenage grandson. He explains how he'd been asked to contribute to the translation of the Jerusalem Bible and a version of the Book of Jonah, and he'd just been elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. On the strength of The Lord of the Rings, I suppose, a pleasant compliment and pat of approval, and one which few, if any, philologists or language men have received. Another of the many indications that he saw his fictional books as an offshoot of his linguistic interests, something many critics would do well to ponder. He talks about supervising the Dutch edition of The Lord of the Rings and translating Jonah and how he's immersed in a study of Hebrew. He says of that, if you want a beautiful but idiotic alphabet and a language so difficult it makes Latin or Greek seem footling, but also glimpses into a past that makes Homer seem recent, that is the stuff. I'm hoping when I retire to get included in a new Bible translation team that is brewing. I've passed the test with a version of the Book of Jonah, not from Hebrew direct. Incidentally, if you ever open the Old Testament and look at Jonah, you'll find that the whale, it's not really said to be a whale, but a big fish, is quite unimportant. The real point is that God is much more merciful than the prophets, is easily moved by penitence, and won't be dictated to even by high ecclesiastics whom he himself has appointed. However, there are too many absorbing things in the world. One has to choose and stick to a few, with which blessing and counsel like preachers I end, and with my love and good wishes, grandfather. It was only when rereading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings after my intensive linguistic studies at St Andrews, I began to appreciate and find delight in the connections between Tolkien's philological skills and wisdom and his fictional work. I was lucky to see a great deal of him during my subsequent B.Phil studies at Oxford, and knowing how beset he was by pundits and enthusiasts, in the derogatory 17th century sense of that word, I was scrupulous about not bothering him with the many linguistic questions that reading his books had provoked. But this was probably a mistake, since his correspondence with me and many readers that he never met revealed a generous professional concern to examine the derivations and the etymology of the names with their attached legends in the books. Two of my favourite passages from the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf happen to involve the words mark or mirk. First, Mjarkstapper, wanderer in the waste borderland, a term to describe Grendel, the outcast monster who burns and plunders Hrothgar's hall. Secondly, landgemerche, a land boundary. The English reads, sea-wise Beowulf led them right down to the land's edge. I also had in mind the phrase over Mirkan Moor. Beowulf. It's in Beowulf where Mirke means dark or sinister, describing the retreat of Grendel's mother with her slaughtered human prey. Now, I'd been pondering over the name Mirkwood in The Hobbit, and I wrote to him about this. Did it mean, as in the Anglo-Saxon, Mirk or Gemirce, a boundary or marker of the edge of the wild? Or was it derived from another word, mirke, dark or sinister? His reply was so meticulous and revealing, even citing materials from an ancient Scandinavian saga, where there is a forest called Märkvi, that it has now in part appeared in the annotated edition of The Hobbit. The details don't matter to a non-specialist, but they do suggest several important general points. First, every authority mentioned involves a legendary or historical association, which enriches the meaning and feeling of the word. Secondly, as often, he felt he was working with material which was part of a huge body of verbal, historical, mythical lore, the keys to which could only be found by perplexing labour, and they might even evade you when you thought you were getting close. It's hardly surprising that he read detective fiction for relaxation and went out of his way to praise Agatha Christie. They actually went and attended an award ceremony together. He always contended, this is the third point, he always contended that The Hobbit was a fragment torn out of an already existing mythology, as he said in his reply to a New York Times book reviewer inquiry in June 1955. It's interesting here that he says that it was great good fortune that Mirkwood remained intelligible with exactly the right tone in modern English. He always said to me that names had the power to generate a story for him. It's well known that he was mystified as to the source of the word hobbit that came to him unbidden in the sentence, "There lived a hobbit in the hole in the ground," when he was marking exam scripts, which is regarded as the pseudo-genesis of that story. And though he did not keep his promise of a comprehensive analysis of the word to those making the supplement to the Oxford Dictionary, there are amusing details about it in a now published letter that he wrote to the editor of The Observer in January 1938. He was always prepared to accept that some things could never be proved one way or another, though he was constantly irritated by those who blew out of proportion matters that had a simple and practical explanation. For instance, he said, it was of no consequence that Bilbo's theft from a dragon's hoard and a parallel act in the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf were similar in their results. How else could you get the dragon on the rampage? But characteristic of my grandfather's lively methods of inquiry and often quizzical pursuit of detail is the moment in the 4th chapter of The Two Towers, where the Ent tree bird and Merry and Pippin discuss their names and origins. I refer to the passage beginning, Pippin, though still amazed, no longer felt afraid, and ending where Treebird declares, real names tell you the story of the things they belong to in my language. In the old Entish, you might say. It is a lovely language, but it takes a very long time to say anything in it, because we do not say anything unless it is worth taking a long time to say and to listen to. Treebeard is almost a ponderous pedagogue, but suddenly his alliterative rhythmic search for the key adds new dimensions to the inquiry. And Pippin's adding a new line in similar style is the kind of solution to a textual omission that Tolkien had provided in his scholarly work at editing poems like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. At this moment, we almost expect an analysis of the term hobbit, but with narrative tact, the author allows the Ents' more intriguing lore of names and stories to predominate. And what Treebeard says of names telling stories indicates one of Tolkien's creative mainsprings. It's therefore worth noting that after my uncle Christopher Tolkien had been lecturing on the heroes of Northern legend at St Anne's College, Oxford, my grandfather said to him in a letter, I am a pure philologist. I like history, but its finest moments for me are those where it throws light on words and names. Nobody believes me when I say that my long book is an attempt to create a world in which a form of language agreeable to my personal aesthetic might seem real. And when W.H. Audlin was due to talk about The Lord of the Rings on the radio in June 1955, Tolkien wrote and told him that languages and names are for me inextricable from the stories. These are an attempt to give a background or world in which my expressions of linguistic taste could have a function. The stories were relatively late in coming. Both letters are fully published. He loved riddles, posing puzzles and finding surprising solutions. Riddles have rules. The unforgettable contest between Bilbo and Gollum is a reminder. They are an art form in Anglo-Saxon, and nearly 100 of varying merit survive. He liked the challenge of the rules and challenging you with them. But like Gandalf, he'd often triumph by telling you there were ways of bypassing the rules without necessarily breaking them. And his talk about words and their origins was often like this. It's apt to round off focus on Tolkien as a philologist with some excerpts from Tree and Leaf, the essay on fairy stories, and in particular where it focuses on fantasy. First, to show his insistence that the powers of language and story making are indivisible. The mind that thought of light, heavy, grey, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic that would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn grey lead into yellow gold, and the still rock into swift water, put hot fire into the belly of the cold worm. But in such fantasy, it is called, new form is made. Theory, it begins. The nearest modern translation I can arrive at for this medieval term is magical transformation. He also talks of his own development. I can only say that a liking for fairy stories was not a dominant characteristic of my early taste, but it was wakened by philology on the threshold of manhood and quickened to full life by war. A longer excerpt reveals, first, the high priority given to the craft of words, and secondly, the view that true fantasy requires a special skill. Let me quote, anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say the green sun. Many can then imagine or picture it, but that's not enough, though it may already be a more potent thing than many a thumbnail sketch or transcript of life that receives literary praise. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art. Indeed, narrative art, story making in its most potent mode. He goes on to say that the truest fantasy is achieved by words. What passes for such in painting or drama is fundamentally different, and by misguided association demeans the former art. My talk is partly intended to indicate aspects of the author's interests and concerns, which I believe are easily overlooked. But I'm also trying to illustrate what it was like to be his grandson. So I'm going to introduce some of the more random aspects of his personality. A reference to his own ingenious story, Leaf by Niggle, serves both my purposes. By fairy, here, we should perhaps understand strange enchantment. The title refers to a single leaf sketch, left over from a painting of vast ambition and scale, and never finished. It was written at the same time as he was composing the essay I've just quoted from, and published along with it in 1947. We can read into it some of his confusion as to what direction his ambitious and increasingly daunting saga of the Ring might take. But I'm going to look at a few parts that sum up some of the aspects of his behavior as I knew them. Niggle's conflict between absorption in his art, the status of which he is unsure, and his kindly, sociable heart was something I noticed in my grandfather's conflict between the life of the study and other unavoidable daily distractions. His study felt like a sacred precinct to children of both generations, though he himself might often hate it and curse it, feel worried about becoming too buried in it, and yet feel compelled back to it. But I don't want to be absolute and say that Niggle is J.R.R. And like all superimpositions of theory on such stories, seeking for a consistent pattern, it would wreck the enchantment, the flexibility and the inherent inner consistency. In Anglo-Saxon, spell meant meant tale or story, and I'm tempted to call the critical searcher of this sort a spellbreaker. By the same token, Bilbo is not J.R.R. Loath as the former was to be moved from his set routine and go at Gandalf's suggestion on an apparent wild goose chase beyond the Shire borders. The opening of Leaf by Niggle reveals a similar theme. There was once a little man called Niggle who had a long journey to make. He did not want to go. Indeed, the whole idea was distasteful to him, but he could not get out of it. He knew he would have to start sometime, but he did not hurry with his preparations. He is in fact rebuked for his indulgence over a vast painting that seemed to be getting nowhere, when there were so many practical issues that required his attention. Tolkien's ability to achieve some kind of resolution of the conflicts between his inner life, his professional duties, and his family demands and other sociable activities, I believe, is part of his stature as a man and reflects the humanity we find in the most endearing of his fictional heroes. Looking back in 1962, he wrote, "I was anxious about my own internal tree, The Lord of the Rings. It was growing out of hand and revealing endless new vistas. I wanted to finish it, but the world was threatening." When Frodo, the ring-bearer, glimpses his uncle Bilbo in the Mirror of Galadriel in the Fellowship of the Ring, Book 2, it conjures up my grandfather's state of mind. To quote, "Walking restlessly about his room, the table was littered with disordered papers. He then sees scenes felt to be part of a great history that Bilbo, like Tolkien, was trying to piece together and somehow involves his nephew, the results of which, incidentally, were called shapeless by critics unable to perceive the remarkable coherence of the trilogy." I'm often asked if he was the archetypal absent-minded professor. I suppose it fits the vulgar image of a fantasy writer. I think had he been, his life would have been easier and his art less rich, even if we just use the cliche that great art comes out of various kinds of tension. I think I recall Doris Lessing saying on a radio interview that all artists are in a sense neurotics, desperately trying to be normal. The trouble is, all such grain of truth comments may be latched onto, and you find people who are tense and neurotic, assuming that they have an artistic temperament and very much to say to mankind. Normality is, of course, by definition, indefinable. But Tolkien, for me, was positively, even pointedly normal and rooted, even if he had annoying and lovable eccentricities. For example, it was clear to me that he could be immensely dilatory, happily idle, and apt to damn the overwhelming standards of perfection that he had set himself. And once out of his study, he was capable of being dynamically entertaining, the most patient and affectionate, and only to us as grandchildren, not only to us as grandchildren, but also, for example, in dealing with the deserving cases of those fans who were genuinely helped and moved by his books. Like Niggle too, he was a perfectionist over a huge canvas, and he set himself remorseless standards in creating his fantasies. often in face of the kind of criticism that he anticipated, where the self-important counsellor Tompkins is condemning Niggle on common sense and commercial grounds. Listened to by Atkins, described earlier as nobody of importance, just a schoolmaster, who tries in an embarrassed way to defend the imagination. There is also Perkins, a non-entity, who feels arguments are just a disturbance. The telling passage I refer to is a reminiscing dialogue between these characters, right at the end of the tale and before the brief summary dialogue of the voices. I recommend you to read that and to ponder on Tolkien. Ironically, though, Tolkien was to be persecuted far more by those bursting to be informed about every vein and particle of his leaves. And I think he liked the world's Tompkinses and Atkinses a lot better than those who cross-questioned him once he became a media hit, making him feel, he said, like an overplayed instrument. When he moved into rooms in Merton College from his retirement home in Poole after the death of my grandmother in the winter of 1971, he wrote to me saying, "Alas, I shall no longer be protected from snoopers, goopers, press groups, phone bugs, and transatlantic lion hunters and gargoyle fanciers." Unlike Niggle, Tolkien was not just puzzled by bureaucrats and officials who pooled their rank on him. He loathed them, though he could often win them over with genuine courtesy, which came from forgiving them for what they stood for and seeing them as people. And then he would boast about how he'd won them over and sing their praises. Like Jonathan Swift, he found humanity hard to bear, but he had a love for individual Jacks and Jills. Writing to me when I was on holiday with my family on the edge of Dartmoor in 1957, he said, "I should have loved to have been with you on the high tors and away from people, that is, folk in the mass." He always maintained that he was affable but unsociable. Most readers of his work now realize something that soon dawned on me from all this. He was fascinated by the miraculous capacity of small and insignificant people, like H.G. Wells's Mr. Polly, to achieve the unexpected in face of apparently insuperable odds. He said quite openly that his time in the trenches in the Great War stamped this feeling on his imagination. Two excerpts from Elrond's words at the council in the Fellowship of the Ring are powerful reminders of this. I remember him quoting the first one on a radio interview. "This quest may be attempted by the weak with as much hope as the strong. Yet such is oft the course of deeds that move the wheels of the world. Small hands do them because they must, while the eyes of the great ones are elsewhere." It's reasonable to infer from these unpatronizing and unsentimental comments by Elrond a crucial and central theme in his major works, even when the protagonists are in the guise of semi-mortal folk. The second excerpt is where Elrond addresses Frodo as the ring-bearer. "This is the hour of the Shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great. Who of all the wise could have foreseen it? Or if they are wise, why should they expect to know it until the hour has struck?" In different guises, this major theme is worked out in all the fantasies. In interesting contrast, Thomas Hardy, in his well-known poem about the 1914-18 war, In Time of the Breaking of Nations, pays tribute to the unconsciously passive resistance of rooted rural people to upheavals even as cataclysmic as that terrible war. Only a man harrowing clods in a slow, silent walk, with an old horse that stumbles and nods, half asleep as they stalk. only thin smoke without flame from heaps of couch grass. Yet this will go onward the same, though dynasties pass. Yonder a maid and her white come whispering by. War's annals will cloud into night ere their story die. Now Tolkien and his spokesman share admiration for these perennial qualities, but in contrast explore the unlikely active resistance from such modest sources. Though, of course, there is a reprisal for the Shire and its devastating scouring as depicted in the penultimate chapter in The Return of the King. I think my grandfather, like the poets Thomas Hardy and Edward Thomas, knew that the old ways could no longer survive, any more than the old order in the Shire could, though the qualities of character they generated might well persist in other guises. I thought, perhaps mistakenly, that I could easily envisage the Shire, since I was brought up in the early 1950s in what was then a remote corner of the Oxfordshire Chilterns. I went to a village school, I danced the maypole, I helped with the harvest, I spoke a dialect my parents couldn't understand, and I had my foot scooter mended by the village blacksmith. Equally though, in the suburbs of Birmingham, when staying with relatives, I learned to appreciate the qualities of low-profile, hard-working people who kept, in Tolkien's phrase, the wheels of the world turning. Turning when powerful people with public responsibilities were making destructive or corrupt decisions. Although it was always difficult to keep track of my grandfather's views, which might modify or intensify without warning, my grandfather had his feet firmly on the ground. This earthed quality is reflected in the precision of geography and timescales in his major work, from which researchers and graphic artists have made much capital. He is even reputed to have been an expert on the habits and features of the house sparrow, and gave a paper to an ornithological society. If he had an enthusiasm for a person, place, or gadget, an item of food or drink, he could always defend his preference, but weeks or months later you might find him demolishing it just as persuasively. Both his children and their successors would agree that it was possible to pass in and out of favour without knowing it if you happen not to have visited my grandparents' home for some while. But looking back, I think these eccentricities added to the affection that I felt for him, and I was more likely to follow his advice than that of my parents, even though it wasn't necessarily any better. He had a way of making me see the real world of living, breathing, and often inexplicable things in a new light. In Tree and Leaf, he maintains that such reappraisal of the familiar is achieved in a well-composed fantasy or tale of fairy. I've said in balanced critical terms, Tolkien should not be identified absolutely with Nigel or Bilbo, or for that matter, Frodo, or the just but fallible heroes of the Silmarillion. But I always found something of my grandfather in the stories. Innumerable shades of attitude and tone, in hundreds of details, of course, but particularly in the figure of Gandalf, who is as vital offstage as when he's central to the action. In The Hobbit, his presence in the dialogue and narrative is small, and in The Lord of the Rings, members of the Fellowship are either waiting for him to show up or frustrated by his absence. Overjoyed too when he returns as Gandalf the White after having won what always seems the fatal tussle with the Balrog of Moria. Tolkien had just this very kind of ever-present distance and occasional close intimacy in the pattern of my life. And I'd like to illustrate this with some images of Gandalf, which are in turn an opportunity to glance at the man and the writer on territory familiar to most readers. Gandalf takes the view that life is inevitably an adventure, not a series of easy routines, and that each traveller is of vital importance in some mysterious way. How is for them to find out, though he'll guide them periodically, if unpredictably. This is the authorial voice embodied in an authoritative figure, but never too obtrusively. Just before Bilbo and the dwarves encounter the trolls, they noticed that Gandalf was missing. So far, he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure. He'd eaten most, talked most, laughed most. No, he simply was not there at all. There's similar outrage just before they enter Mirkwood, after enjoying the hospitality of Beorn. They sense that he is about to leave them, and they receive sharp words about taking responsibility for their own expedition. I find here all the unpredictable reliability and rather irritable kindness of Tolkien. I would react as the party did, with a mixture of exasperation, affection, need, and respect. It also reminds me how he could exert authority and influence without domineering. Gandalf, like him, also understated what was of huge consequence in his own business, which is at least indirect evidence that the Hobbit was only a fragment of a much larger concept and emphatically not the starting point of his imaginative world, as many continue to suppose. In the first of these excerpts, we see Gandalf's relish for fun and the good things of life, his tricking of the trolls into arguing beyond the dawn that transformed them to harmless stone, and much later on, of course, his tossing of lighted fir cones at the wild wolves, also illustrates this aspect of my grandfather. One of my earliest memories, I'm probably 7 or 8, was of a long family walk down overgrown lanes in the wooded Chiltern Hills north of Reading, where, as I indicated, I was lucky to be brought up before the district was, in inverted commas, developed into dormer villages. Hedgerow hemlock and hogweed were in flower. He called their white inverted umbrellas wasps' tables, and constantly upset these predators by dashing in with his stick and slicing off a table, telling us to run for it. It made us hysterical with excitement, much to my mother's silent irritation. We also delighted in a game where he threatened with all kinds of murderous and menacing gestures to catch us with the hooked end of his stick. The stick, mischievous as Gandalf's wand, was part of one of his funniest stunts. A loud "Hoy!" and violent waving at motorists hogging country lanes as if they owned them. In the same vein, but many, many years later, when he was 81, I remember him racing my then 4-year-old daughter Catherine round the great lime trees of Merton College Gardens. This was on the occasion when I took the last photograph of him leaning on his favourite tree, included in the illustrations of Carpenter's biography. Another aspect of Gandalf that I connect with Tolkien is in the hidden dimension. Like the craggier Doctor Who impersonators, he might seem at times to be rather old, tired, frail, battered by the demands of a perverse world. His elvish name is Mithrandir, the great pilgrim. But he was a Maya, one of the ancient Istari or wizards. In the Two Towers, he comments on his former stature. Olorin I was in my youth in the West that is forgotten. In The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, his deep wisdom is disguised, a powerful irony against his enemies. Throughout The Hobbit, he seems just persuasively managerial towards Bilbo and the dwarves, until his spirit towers into authority, and as if almost a part of the mounting winter thunderstorm, he halts the advancing dwarves of the Iron Hills before the battle of the Five Armies to avoid the destructive impact of internecine conflict in face of the overwhelming forces of darkness. "Halt!" cried Gandalf, who appeared suddenly and stood alone with arms uplifted between the advancing dwarves and the ranks awaiting them. "Halt!" he cried, in a voice like thunder, and his staff blazed forth with a flash like the lightning. "Dread has come upon you all. Alas, it has come more swiftly than I guessed." This is part of a passage, incidentally, that shows Tolkien's capacity to adapt language and create a style of epic resonance in both speech and narrative, a feature found on a larger scale in many of the great battle scenes of The Return of the King, and of course frequently in the tales of the earlier ages. Like Gandalf too, my grandfather delighted in winning without being boastful about it. He had a knack of mastering techniques at lightning speed and dumbfounding the experts because he could genuinely play at light-hearted things. I recall endless rounds of clock golf with him at the Hotel Miramar in Bournemouth, and his delight in successions of holes in one, as if they were quite natural to him. This winning capacity is captured for me, where Gandalf explains to Thorin why he kept the map, explaining to the astonished dwarf company that he had visited their leader's father in the dungeons of the necromancer. "Right, I was finding things out as usual, and a nasty, dangerous business it was. I tried to save your father, but it was too late. He was witless and wandering, and had forgotten almost everything except the map and the key." Now I can hear Bilbo urging on Gollum in the subterranean lakeside riddles test with "time's up." Or as Eliot says in The Wasteland, "Hurry up, please, it's time." Like him too, I'm trying to sound bold and confident. But like Gollum, I'm going to cheat by working in several other items at once, including other crucial parts of my memory and experience of Tolkien that I would like to have covered. His love of the family unit, his vital role as its head and keystone, our mutual interest in and love for the Welsh language, on which the Sindarin tongue, a grey elven language, was modelled, the many jokes he made about money and payment in his letters for Christmas and birthdays, reminding me of those in his illustrated children's tale, Mr. Bliss. I might have examined the informed love of trees that he bequeathed to me. Talking of the inadequacy of drama as a mode for fantasy in Tree and Leaf, he says almost obliquely, "There could be very little about trees, as trees cannot be got into a play," as if a medium that denied us that facility was inevitably limited. Well, I think of the many stage stunts to suggest the advance of Bernard Wood to Dunsinane in Macbeth, and I recall in contrast the graphically described wrath of the Ents vented on Isengard and on Sauron's forces. Trees demand a last aggression, I'm afraid. If I were asked to read from a work not sufficiently acknowledged, in my opinion, it might be a passage from his translation of Sir Gawain of the Green Knight. He composed it in a modernized form of the original mid-14th century poem's alliterating measures. I choose it too because he felt an affinity with this poem. Like his own tales and most medieval fantasies, this is an adventure, to use an inadequate substitute for the medieval word pronounced entour, that meant taking a risk which involved moving beyond set patterns, discovering other sides of the world, and therefore of oneself, which is what happens in distinct ways to Nigel, to Bilbo, Frodo, and others. And I'd like to read from where Sir Gawain enters the grim forest in his long search for Sir Bertilac's castle just before Christmas. Incidentally, his anxieties over what is now called the run-up to Christmas are rather different from ours. The descriptive emphases, the devout attitudes, and the deft choice of words are all for me essential Tolkien. By a mount in the morning merrily he was riding, into a forest that was deep and fearsomely wild, with high hills at each hand and hoar woods beneath of huge aged oaks by the hundred together. The hazel and the hawthorn were huddled and tangled with rough ragged moss around them trailing, with many birds bleakly on the bare twigs sitting, that piteously piped there for pain of the cold. The good man on Gringalet goes now beneath them through many marshes and mires, a man all alone, troubled lest a truant at that time he should prove from the service of the sweet Lord, who on that selfsame night of a maid became man our mourning to conquer. And therefore sighing, he said, I beseech thee, O Lord, and Mary, who is the mildest mother most dear, for some harbour where with honour I might hear the mass and thy matins tomorrow. This meekly I ask, and thereto promptly I pray, with Pater and Ave and Creed. In prayer he now did ride, lamenting his misdeed. He blessed him oft and cried, the cross of Christ me speed. I suppose I could have dealt with many of the adverse criticisms of Tolkien's work, but I prefer to end positively with my own estimate of the quality and continued popularity of Tolkien. People of all ages like the books because the tales adjust themselves to who you are when you are reading them. So there's always something new to discover, a quality he defines in Tree and Leaf. I doubt if the enchantment of effective fairy stories becomes blunted by use, less potent after repeated drafts. But much of the appeal lies in the complete and consistent imaginative world, which includes characters and situations with which we can identify without being bombarded by messages and engineered layers of meaning. Also, the living, breathing world that Tolkien presents has all the uplifting yet intractable and unpredictable features of the world that we've come to take for granted or simply ignore because of many alienating factors I needn't enumerate. In these so-called fantasies, we encounter a reality that we somehow overlooked or taken for granted. And I often wonder if there was a similar reawakened awareness of a tangible, natural world in the impact made by the Romantic poets on those who'd become undernourished by an urbane, strictly formal and sophisticated literature of an age where nature came to mean a balanced, regulated, hierarchical order. The books are classics. Up-to-date, state-of-the-art bestsellers, of course, have the important but limited function of mirroring one age. But Tolkien's works touch on universal and timeless issues that have the stature of myth. Every age spawns myths to deal with its fears or its ambitions. We can all think of contemporary ones. And it's interesting that Tolkien maintained that even Arthurian myth was limited because of its two specifically Christian elements. He said, myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain elements of moral and religious truth and error, but not explicitly, not in the known form of the primary real world. In his letter to Milton Veldman of Collins Publishers in 1951, he said that. Significantly, he disliked most modern attempts to rewrite or even reinterpret old materials. He felt they led to uncertainties of tone or spirit. When I first read Christopher Tolkien's sensitively and profoundly informed editing and reconstruction that produced what is now known as the Silmarillion, I was moved to encounter what clearly lay at the heart of my grandfather's vision of an entire coordinated history. I'd spent many hours with him in his last days, and I often saw masses of scattered manuscripts on the desk in his lodgings in Merton Street. He frequently lamented his incapacity to make decisions or fuse together so many versions and sketched episodes of a work he felt had been neglected for his immersion in the tales and conflicts of a later age of Middle-earth's annals. In his stories, I believe, he returns us in an accessible way to what the psychiatrist and polymath Jung called the archetypes, the mythical patterns that lie buried in us from the long human quest for truth about who we are and why we are here. Pippin's attempt to recall the Treebeard's eyes captured this subconscious mythical impact. Behind these eyes, he said he felt, as if there was an enormous well filled up with ages of memory and long, slow, steady thinking. But their surface was sparkling with the present, like sun shimmering on the outer leaves of a vast tree or on the ripples of a deep lake. Such intuitively profound insights into the perspectives of history were moving to Tolkien, and he found his characters surprised him with them. For me personally, he was one such archetype, as I hope my talk has implied. His death in September 1973 first made mortality real to me. I'd lost other loved and close relatives, but his passing removed a center of gravity, a source of unity, a formative influence I'm still piecing together 51 years later. His uniqueness can be no better distilled for me than in these words from the Silmarillion. In that time, the last of the Noldor set sail from the havens and left Middle-earth forever. Thank you.
Very much, Michael, for a tour de force into the depth, Tolkien's sensitivity, personality, also for this great performance. We can feel the energy in a way and the affection. We got 20 minutes for Q&A, so please don't be shy. Please, can I ask Grace to take 2 microphones? Yes, please. Thank you. Go over there, guys.
Well, thank you so much. That was an incredible talk. I very much enjoyed that. I should like to ask you about your grandfather's relationship to John Henry Newman. And I was wondering if you could say, or should I?
I can hear you perfectly well. There's no need for that lollipop.
If you could say a few words about that, about whether that was something you ever...
Well, I don't know very much, really, about what he felt about John Henry Newman. I have to be honest with you. But I mean, the connection I've always remembered, of course, is the statue of John Henry Newman, which was transported to the Oratory School in Woodcote, because my father actually helped to put that school back on its feet in the 1950s. So that was the reason I was in the Chiltern Hills. That it's not a very useful answer. I'm sorry, but
thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd like. Well, I must refresh on that. Yeah.
Please. I'll ask a question myself. You think I was very struck by something you said about these tensions. I mean, great art is made of tensions, and you talked about your grandfather in a way as a man of tensions, almost contradictions.
Yes.
And yet at the end, you said something which seems contradictory. You said, I mean, for me, my grandfather was a source of unity.
Yeah, for
How
me, yes.
to you?
For me personally.
How can you bring the two things together? I mean, in a sense, is it possible to articulate an idea of a man of tensions, in a sense, but also a man who is united, in a sense?
Well, I think it was because he was a source of unity in the family. You know, he was kind of figurehead in many ways, and the conflict that I'm talking about writing about yourself or not writing about yourself or writing for your opposite, which Yeats, of course, was very concerned about. I'm sure that was sort of part of his thing. I'm actually trying to get away from any ideas of rigid identity between characters in his work, you know, and he himself. But for me, I mean, personally, of course, it's quite different that he was a source of unity because he held everything together. You know, the world sort of fell apart for me temporarily.
Can I ask a follow up on this? Because many people have noted, have argued that Tolkien was a sort of, let's say, almost schizophrenic personality. Say that on the one hand, for instance, he was a Catholic, but on the other hand, he was very pessimistic. I've noted that on the one hand, he was joyful and optimistic, but on the other, he was very depressed. From your experience and knowledge of him, do you think there were these contradictions in his personality?
Well, yeah, because I mean, his experience of the world, you know, difficult upbringing and transportation from South Africa to Worcestershire, extremely difficult courtship that he had to undergo, plunged into the 1480 war before he could actually finish his degree. The experience of the war itself is hardly surprising. You know, there was a great deal under the surface there, really. Yes, he was often very irascible and difficult, but also very loving and very kind. And so there were conflicts, you know. I mean, fundamentally, I think all Tolkien's have got quite a lot of anger under the surface, which they keep repressed. So that's, yeah.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you for a very moving talk, I found. But I was particularly struck by your comment that Tolkien was not sympathetic to the use of theatre for the portrayal of fantasy. I wonder, do you have any thoughts as to the use of film? And I'm not, of course, speaking about the Peter Jackson films. Let us put those to one side. But
is Peter Jackson here?
Do you have a comment on the capability, perhaps, of film to convey fantasy, perhaps, in ways that theatre couldn't?
That's very difficult, really, because he didn't really get to see any of the film versions. I mean, I think it's common knowledge that he sold the film rights in order to pay a tax bill. So clearly, we had no say in any of the first lot of films. But I think actually my grandfather was very open to impressions, and he would surprise you really with being interested in something novel that hadn't really appeared yet, and he could be fascinated by things if they were well presented, if he felt that people had done a job that was integral with what they were trying, you know, with their aims and so on. So, and I think he would have been interested in the films.
Was he indeed a lover of cinema?
Sorry?
Was he a lover of cinema?
I can't recall really any having any conversations with him about particular films. No. That may not be because he didn't want to go to the cinema. It may have been that he simply didn't allow himself time to do it. It's difficult, really. It's an interesting question. Yeah.
We have, if I may something, on the new edition of Letters, we have him talking about a movie he watched, Bernadette.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Oh,
and he
yeah.
goes on. He wasn't there in the first edition.
No.
And I mean, he loved the movie. I mean, because of his content, but he has something to say also on the cinematic genre as such, and he's a bit critical, at least. It seems like that in a way there are some sort of deficiencies, but it's only one thing. I mean, there are a few letters, however, about. I think that's the only evidence we have that he ever went to the cinema for this particular movie.
Yeah.
There's one play he enjoyed. Didn't he enjoy Peter Pan?
Oh, yes. Yes, he did.
1911 or something like that.
Yes, and he used to go to dramas at the Dragon School. You know, when my cousin Simon was there, he accompanied him to those, and he really enjoyed them, because of course they were of a very good standard, and he really enjoyed them. Yeah, he was very positive about that. Yeah.
Michael.
Thank you for your talk. You began by remarking on how you share the same surname as your grandfather.
Yeah.
Could you perhaps say something about that other name in your family, Rule?
It's a very difficult one, that, because nobody really knows. I mean, we know that the nickname Tolkien probably was received by a cavalry officer at the siege of Vienna. You know, when it's being besieged by the Turkish armies of Suleiman the Magnificent, but nobody really knows, to be honest. I mean, I was often under the impression that it was like a German term for royal, but that's completely wrong. And it might be a name like Raoul, you know, which is a family name that's come from somewhere. It's a mystery to me. It really is. I mean, we've all got it, and we've got to live with it. But it's one of those sort of loose ends. You know, my grandfather certainly was resigned to not knowing. And if he was resigned, then, you know, it's a fascinating name. It really is. I hope that it's derived from Raoul. I mean, I really do. You know, I would like to think it was derived from that, but I can't be certain. You know.
Thank you so much. That was such a privilege to listen to. I was wondering about his Anglo-Saxon, his work on things other than Beowulf, because the Beowulf work is so much more famous, and also how much I read one comment that he didn't think that Cynewulf was very interesting. It is true that a lot of Old English poetry is allegorical, and it's not the sort of thing that he was trying to do in fairy stories.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of difficulty. This is really fascinating, but I'm only picking up some parts of what you're saying.
When you finish the question, I will explain.
Yeah.
Is it better?
Yep, that's better. Yeah.
So I was wondering his thoughts on Beowulf are of course much more famous than his thoughts on other Old English literature, and I'm curious how his taste met some of the more religious Old English poems, because they're often allegorical and they're not the sort of thing that he was trying to do in his own writing. So
yeah. And
I remember reading one comment about Cynewulf being somewhat of a bore. So
yeah.
I was wondering if you had thought.
Well, I mean, for example, the Pearl is clearly an allegorical poem. And he loved that poem for its technique and for its music and also its linguistic problems. But he didn't really sort of say not. You know, he didn't sort of run the allegory down. I mean, he and C.S. Lewis, of course, had a slight controversy over the issue of allegory. I mean, Tolkien was dubious about its value, whereas C.S. Lewis wrote very persuasively about its value. So it's a difficult one, really. You're quite right, of course. This was creeping into medieval poetry in a massive way, so I don't know. I mean, he always told me he didn't have much time for Chaucer, but then you couldn't really be sure that next week he might not have picked something out that he really loved about it. You know, it's very difficult, really, to get any consistent pattern of commentary. I mean, his real strength lay, I think, in very specific analysis of texts, where he was close to the text and he could see the variations and the probabilities, and also he was very, very good at sussing out which words were obviously the ones that were to keep and the ones to jettison, you know. But I don't think that's at all a satisfactory answer to your question. I'm sorry, but yeah, it's caught me on the hop, really. That.
Thank you. That was such a wonderful talk. I think the bit that really jumped out to me was the stories about etymologies of words and popular names for botanical plants and place names and so on.
Yeah.
And for someone who was always regaling his own children with these stories, it was really heartening to realise that even now you still remember the etymology of butterfly and the problems around
yes.
it.
Yes, exactly.
You get a real sense of him from that.
Yes.
But my question was really about, you mentioned his love of riddles,
yes,
word games generally. I know other people have spoken about him in retirement as someone who's incessantly playing word games.
Oh, yes.
Doing crosswords and things.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Any sort of particular insights about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, he did like that sort of thing. Yes. I mean, that's just a fact of his, his taste. Really, he liked that type of thing. I mean, actually, it's quite interesting because the riddles in The Hobbit are a great deal better and much more precise than. I mean, I've just reread all the Anglo-Saxon riddles, and some of them are really pretty verbose, actually. But there's a wonderful crispness about that riddle game. He was almost doing what he thought the Anglo-Saxons ought to have done with the riddle. Especially when it's life-threatening, as it was in those circumstances. But yes, he did like verbal puzzles, and he liked unraveling verbal puzzles. Yes, definitely. Yeah. Hello.
I just wondered if the language was so important to him, how do you feel about translations?
Yes, I thought that question might come up because having read that excerpt from Gawain, I then said that he didn't like modernized versions of things. He was a bit sort of suspect about them. But I think what he was trying to do in the Gawain was he was trying to write in the spirit of the original, which is what all good translation is. The spirit of the original is there. This is where some of the 17th century translations are really very, very good, like John Dryden's translation of Virgil, for example. But they're not actually modernizations. They're getting under the skin of the original poem, which he knew so intimately, and he taught it. He'd co-edited with E.V. Gordon. He co-edited the Sir Gawain. So I think this doesn't fall into the category of a modernization of some well-known story. Doesn't fall into that category at all. I think when we read Sir Gawain, the Green Knight, in his translation, we're much closer to what an audience in that day might have felt about it and how they might have responded. I mean, it's become a bit of a football, this thing. It's been translated by God knows how many people. I mean, it's like Beowulf, there's so many bad translations that it's lovely to read a translation like this, I think, that retains the spirit of the original and is written by somebody who really understands and has got underneath the skin of that poem.
Thank you so much. I really loved your thoughts on seeing your grandfather in the character of Gandalf.
Yes.
I'm wondering, did you see any of your other relatives in any of the other characters? Or any of the close friends that you knew?
Perhaps I ought to analyse carefully the dwarf community in The Hobbit. What I was going to say to take up your comment was that you may have been surprised that I kind of weighted my reminiscences to The Hobbit with Gandalf. And there were two reasons for that. One, because as a grandson, I was much more in the position of the characters in The Hobbit than those in The Lord of the Rings. And secondly, I actually want to remind everybody about what a superb story The Hobbit is, because I do think it's taken for granted. And I do think people in the Battle of the Five Armies don't realize that there's a very special style. It's an epic episode. So he was doing lots of things in The Hobbit, which weren't exactly picked up in the film trio. So I really wanted to offset the balance. Yeah.
Thank you again for your talk. You provided a very effective psychoanalytic reading regarding Jungian archetypes, and I was wondering if
I think you'll have to go on the meeting.
Sorry. Thank you again for your talk. You gave a very good psychoanalytic reading of Jungian archetypes, but I was wondering if you had anything to say about Christian archetypes in his work.
Well, no, not really, because I think the strength of The Lord of the Rings, the strength of all his stories really, is that there's a great big absence of any allusions to any specific religions or any specific spiritual persuasions. He's nevertheless able to convey in the stories the principles of behavior that should apply to any of the world religions, really. It's more like what they've all got in common without realizing it that you get. And that's what I mean, really, by, and that was his criticism of Arthurian legend. Because Arthurian legend, obviously, it came to a head in the 15th century. And the 15th century had this, what I might call religious anxiety, really. This sort of feeling that a great era was coming to an end and that everything was being questioned. And therefore, there was a sort of digging in, really, well, you can see it in Mallory's work, you know. There was an anxiety to establish the great Christian message. And my grandfather thought that was too pervasive in a way, really. You know, in many ways, Tennyson's Idylls of the King, of course, which is a great version of all those Arthurian stories. I mean, that too was about the demise, the threatened demise of an age that he could sense was coming to an end. I think it's known as God's funeral or something. Yeah.
Question up there. Are you happy to continue 5 minutes?
Pardon?
Are you happy to continue for 5 minutes?
Yes, I mean, I'm fine, yes.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering, you talked a lot about Tolkien as a linguist and a fiction writer, but was also a very accomplished physical artist. And I was just wondering if you have any comments on how he felt about physical art in the creative process, or as a sort of creative force, or in world building, sort of in that aspect of it.
I got what you were saying about him being Sorry,
visual artist, or what is kind of
yeah,
his
yeah,
experience as a visual artist
yes,
influenced his world building as well. So what's the connection between his literature and his work as a
yeah.
visual artist?
I think the connection between the illustrations, shall we call them, and the work is self-evident. In that if there was a particularly graphic scene or something where his imagination was highly charged, he might well use his graphic skills to produce a drawing or a painting. He was actually quite well trained as an artist in his younger days. Had very good tutoring in art. And actually, it's quite interesting because when the Tolkien calendar comes out, as it has been doing relentlessly for many, many years, I have to, along with my other colleagues, I have to make judgments on this. And I'm always terribly relieved when they go back to having the original Tolkien illustrations because I think they're so close to the spirit of the work. I really do. I mean, there are illustrators that I love who are highly commendable, but they're never there in the same way that Tolkien is with his own illustration. Even some of the sketches that were never fully realized are giving you some information that none of the subsequent artists have been able to provide. I mean, that's a personal view, but I hope it's partly an answer to your question because he clearly illustrated things that he wanted to say more about, if you like. That really is what was I think that was what was going on, actually, I think.
Okay, we have time for two final questions, and if you don't mind, I'll take the liberty to ask you one. Can I ask you about his feelings about the completion of the Silmarillion, or rather the lack of completion of the Silmarillion? You said before that in the final years he was very frustrated about the fact that he couldn't finish it. What do you think about his final decision to entrust Christopher the whole completion of the work?
And Christopher was the obvious person because he was very close to my grandfather at every stage of his creativity. He was also a quite remarkable scholar in his own right, with considerable linguistic knowledge, particularly of medieval and Saxon literature. And so he had obviously had many conversations with my grandfather about the different versions of the Silmarillion. But I mean, I know that he was deeply frustrated in having neglected the Silmarillion to write Lord of the Rings. And actually, for me, when the Silmarillion came out, I thought, God, this is stuff of a totally different order. A really totally different order. It's wonderful that Christopher has edited all these stories that have grown out of it as well, because they're a great heritage. I mean, it's magnificent work. But I don't know. I just think he neglected that. This goes far back, the Silmarillion and its world vision, way back into his time before the 1418 war. And I think he felt it was almost a betrayal, that Allen and Unwin got hold of him and they said, right, well, we want a sequel now. And he said, not more effing hobbits, and I mean, he didn't really want to, but he did it, and then he got very engaged with it. That was the thing. So, yeah.
Final question, I will say, from Grace.
Thank you for ending on a very poignant quote from the Silmarillion, which I'm actually writing my thesis on. I was wondering if you had any personal views about how, or rather why, the Silmarillion is so different in tone from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, why it's so profoundly tragic and almost didactic in a kind of subtle way.
Well, of course, the whole of that tale of the first age is a great elegy in many ways. And the thing that makes it profoundly disturbing, I think, is the fact that it has a very, very considerable spiritual dimension as well. The creation of the world, things going wrong at the start and all the rest of it, and the consequences of that, which can never really be undone. So there is this feeling of doom, inevitably, after, shall we say, the misbehavior of the elves and so on. I think there's a very good reason for that. I think it's darker material, but I think it disturbs you far more than anything in The Lord of the Rings. Personally, that's my personal feeling. Silmarillion came into my life at a moment when I was exceedingly depressed for various reasons. My uncle's book version of it came out in 1977. And contradictory to what you said, it gave me an enormous uplift. It really did inspire me when I read it. And I just got totally immersed in it. A lot of people say, well, yeah, I really love The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all that. But they never bother reading things like Smith of Wootton Major or any of these shorter stories, which are incredibly revealing. And Silmarillion is just a no-go area, really got stuck in Valinor, It's a shame, because it's worth persevering with it. I read the whole of the Silmarillion to my daughter, my youngest daughter, Ruth, when she was, 10, 11, and she loved it. She loved it, She really got immersed in it. She didn't have any hang-ups, you see. She didn't think, oh, this is difficult stuff. She just took it for what it was. Bit like when you're reading Eliot. Don't get too worked up about the illusions. Get immersed in it.
And I think, thank you. I think tonight we have been really immersed into Tolkien's world thanks to your generosity, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you.